Okay, so they move the Germans out and back to Germany. Yeah. Then give the one province to the Poles, and the other split between the Poles and the Soviets. No. I understand the thinking behind it, but it never works well way down the line, you know? Huh? Yeah, who cares about the distant future right now, huh? Well, Stalin and Churchill care. Just saying. All right. October 14th, 1944. The Soviets hit one German army group after another over the summer, doing devastating damage, and they're trying to set up another one. This week comes the isolation of Army Group North. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the fighting continued on Peleliu in the South Pacific, and in Europe, Allied attacks crossed the German, Hungarian, and Yugoslavian borders. The Warsaw Uprising came to its end, and there was a new Soviet offensive in the Baltics. There are plans afoot, in the wake of many successful Allied offensives, for what should happen next. On the 9th, the Moscow Conference begins. It lasts until the 20th. There is a lot of talk about the political future of Eastern Europe. There are reps from the Polish government in exile from London there, and they get no concessions from Joseph Stalin. He also insists that Romania and Bulgaria must completely remain within the Soviet sphere of influence. Greece, though, will be within British influence, and Hungary and Yugoslavia are to be divided. You might think the Western Allies would press for something more here, but nope. See, they very much value his promise to eventually join the war against Japan, and of course the continuing Soviet fight against Germany before doing so. Winston Churchill also tells Stalin he can maybe see the removal of the German population of Silesia and East Prussia to central Germany, and then Silesia could be given to Poland, and East Prussia split between Poland and the USSR. Stuff like that. You know, we've seen a long string of Soviet successes the past few months, particularly against Army Group Center and North Ukraine, but against everyone, really. But taking all that territory really has come at a cost, even during the period of the Warsaw Uprising, when they could not or would not help the Poles. Soviet First Belarusian Front lost 123,000 men in fighting in that general region. And the Soviet units who we saw finally force the Dukla Pass last week and enter Slovakia to try and aid the uprising there, have lost another 80,000 men doing so. The Slovak national uprising has been a success for the Soviets, though, in terms of them sending in their partisan movement across the border, more than anywhere else at any rate. But, as in Poland, those patriots who enjoyed the political support, if not large-scale material aid from the Western powers, were viewed by Stalin as inherently and unalterably hostile to the Soviet Union. Those whom he could not discredit, he set out to destroy. A policy that meant consigning many thousands of the brave political innocents of the anti-Nazi resistance movements to a grisly and untimely death. There is still plenty of actual Red Army fighting in the field this week. The new Baltic offensive against Army Group North is really rolling. Already the 8th, elements of Ivan Bagramian's 1st Baltic Front are closing in on Memel's defenses, having torn a hole 70 kilometers deep in the enemy lines and overwhelming the few German divisions they face. On the 10th, they reach the coast, taking Palanga north of Memel. With a huge mass of Soviet force now in place from the coast to dozens of kilometers inland, the isolation of Army Group North is suddenly very much complete. Army Group North commander Ferdinand Schöner asks Adolf Hitler for permission to pull back to the Tukums line west of Riga, but this is denied. Then the 8th, 2nd Baltic Front takes Oger, a few dozen kilometers from Riga. On the 10th comes attempts to storm Riga itself. These fail, but they continue the 11th. Schöner asks again to withdraw. This time, the answer is yes, but not until the evening of the 12th. But the morning of the 12th, the Soviets have battered their way into the city. The German defenses soon disintegrate, and on the 13th, Riga falls to the Soviets. And what happens then? Well, what's left of the Germans around here is 4 or so divisions in Memel and some 30 divisions from the 16th and 18th armies stuck in Courland, whom the Soviets wished to destroy. They reorganized today, the 14th. Ivan Maslenikov's 3rd Baltic Front is disbanded, and elements of it are sent to 1st or 2nd Baltic, for it is they who are to clear Courland, with Andrei Yeremenko's 2nd Baltic attacking west, and Bagramian's 1st northwest, while also hitting Memel and clearing the north bank of the Niemen. That last is pretty much required for any future offensive from here into East Prussia. Ivan Cherniakovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front is going to attack towards Gombinen to tie down enemy force in East Prussia itself. This is scheduled for next week. And further north in Finland, the evacuation of German 20th Mountain Army from northern Finland, ordered last week, was sabotaged by Soviet attacks that began the 7th, as we saw. On the 9th, the Soviets managed to cut the Arctic Ocean highway west of Luostari, and within a couple days hold nearly 10 kilometers of it. On the 13th, they managed to isolate the 2nd and 6th Mountain Divisions, and in 1 week have destroyed a front that took the Germans 3 years to build up. Today, however, the Soviets must stop to regroup. You cannot really maintain that pace of advance for that long in those conditions. But they are advancing all week in Yugoslavia. By the 8th, Soviet troops have a bridgehead over the Morava near Velika Plana. On the 9th, 4th Guards Mechanized Corps gets orders to punch through the gap 68th Corps have created, and then on the 11th should head off to take Belgrade. 4th Guards Mechanized, under Vladimir Zhdanov, has 17,000 men and 180 tanks, and since just September 30th has already crossed basically all of Bulgaria east to west to even reach the border. And to follow his new orders, Zhdanov sends his whole corps towards the Morava in one single column through the foothills and heights, protected by groups of specially mounted machine gunners in case of opposition. By the evening of the 10th, they have finished their march and concentrate around Petrovac, ready for action. They cut the Niš-Belgrade railway line, and already the 8th Bulgarian 2nd Army is ordered to attack towards Niš together with the 13th Corps from the Yugoslavian National Liberation Army. So Fyodor Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front forces are heading for Belgrade from the south, and also Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front is finally moving again, coming from northeast of Belgrade through Versace and Pančevo. In fact, also by the 8th, there are Soviet forces just a few kilometers east of Belgrade, though the mighty Danube is in front of them. With other units further north heading for Petrograd, and with assistance from the Yugoslav army, they've pretty much cleared everything east of the Tisa, and Malinovsky's forces are fighting all along it. I mentioned last week that they began their two-pronged Debrecen operation into Hungary, and that continues. On the 11th, 2nd Ukrainian Front forces cross the Tisa and take Szeged in the south of Hungary. Cluj finally falls as well to the east. Szeged gives a major rail and road hub, and also another crossing of the Tisa. The next day, Yugoslav Marshal Tito's partisans and 2nd Ukrainian units take Subotica, west of Szeged. Oradea also falls to the 2nd Ukrainian Front. Okay, that is one prong of the operation. But what of the other? The one actually going towards Debrecen. Well, on the 10th, Panzer strikes east and west below Debrecen, cut off 3 Soviet corps. But on the 11th, when 6th Guards Tank Army starts trying to free them, it becomes uncertain just who has trapped whom. A wild tank battle develops. The Soviets start pulling loose from the pocket the 12th. The Germans are then pulling back. And by week's end, Army Group South is busy once again trying to establish a line that will prevent the Soviets from advancing northward. Hungary is now under attack along the whole southern and southeastern border. As for Belgrade, Zhdanov's tanks cross the Morava the 12th and are heading towards Topola and Mladenovac south of Belgrade. The German command, desperate to hold its lines of communication with the south until its divisions pulled out of Serbia and Macedonia, was determined to hold Belgrade against all comers, reinforcing the defense with every available man. Now, 3rd Ukrainian Front Commander Fyodor Tolbukhin wants to save Belgrade itself from further destruction as far as possible. I say further because a few months ago, British and American bombers did a number on the city, but he wants to head off the Germans retreating to the city south of it before they can reach it. Soviet planes are harassing the Germans, and 4th Met Corps, together with Yugoslav 1st Proletarian Corps, reaches the Avala Heights. This splits the Germans in half, and Soviet 57th Army surrounds German units from Army Group F southeast of the city near Požarevac. Any German troops heading for the city now have 2 Soviet fronts to deal with. German command in Belgrade has 22,000 men and a few dozen tanks. 20,000 men more are trying to smash their way into the city through the various traps and encirclements, and another 15,000 have managed to beat 57th Army's right flank and are heading along the south bank of the Danube towards the Sava and hopeful freedom to the north. Today, as the week ends, the fight for Belgrade begins. The Soviet attack plan is a narrow frontal attack that ideally will break through the German defenses and into the rear, making haste to secure the bridge over the Sava to cut off either escape or reinforcements. The 1st Proletarian Corps is to ride on the tanks of the Mechanized Corps, and they'll all be supported by the gunboats of the Danube Flotilla. Early this morning, before dawn, there is a brief preliminary artillery barrage, and the assault on the Avala Heights then begins. During the day, the attackers break through the first line of enemy defenses and then head for the city itself. Maximilian von Feix is in overall command of the Axis forces down here and in Greece. And he's lately been having issues making his mind up what to do. Already September 21st, he wrote in his diary that a Soviet offensive towards Niš or Skopje would cut off Army Group E in Greece and the islands. So he'd have to stop the flights moving men from the islands and use the planes to reinforce Macedonia. But he never made the call to do so, even though his forces in the Balkans were at crisis point in terms of force. By the start of October, OKW asked him to just give him a date when Army Group E will really evacuate Greece. He finally said, the 10th is the date to evacuate Greece, Albania, and southern Macedonia. Hitler approves this. Feix dithering all those weeks actually turns out to look pretty good when evacuation begins on the 10th, since Army Group E commander Alexander Löhr has used the month of indecision to ship out all non-combatants and gather enough cars and trucks to be fully mobile. And as they leave, the British and the Greek partisans continue the liberation of Greece, taking Corinth. British landings soon come on Corfu, and the evening of the 11th, the Germans begin evacuating Athens. At 9:15 the morning of the 12th, the swastika flag is taken down from the Acropolis, and Athens is free after 1,265 days of occupation. British troops arrive the 14th, and the Greek government of Georgios Papandreou will arrive next week on the 18th. I'm going to backtrack now and talk more about Hungary for a minute. I talked about recent Hungarian political machinations a few weeks ago, and in late September, Hungarian leader Miklos Horthy sent reps to Moscow to negotiate an armistice. This week on the 11th, they have a draft ready, but it doesn't have a fixed date. Adolf Hitler, though, has sent in 2 of his henchmen to head off any crisis, SS General Erich von den Bach-Zelewski and SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny. For all that Horthy, as Hungarian head of state for over 2 decades, has a great deal of personal prestige, both his authority and his political position have by now been badly undermined. Last week in Parliament, a pro-war, pro-German majority coalition against him was formed. And now on the 8th, the commander of the Budapest garrison, one of Horthy's biggest supporters, is arrested. The army is split, though a lot of senior staff officers do want to continue the fight. It really seems to be reaching a head, as is the continuing strife between Vinegar Joe Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang's response to American President Franklin Roosevelt's dispatch last week about Stilwell is that he wants Stilwell recalled immediately from China, Burma. He has no faith in Stilwell's military judgment. He cannot cooperate with him. And he goes into a bit of detail about what he sees as Stilwell's failures. For example, prioritizing the Myitkyina campaign over fighting against Ishigo in China. In Chiang's view, these actions had a direct consequence. The Burma campaign had sucked away both men and supplies. Stilwell had displayed complete indifference, despite the fact that the nationalist armies in East China faced 6 times the number of forces that Stilwell had to cope with in Burma. Chiang's most pointed accusation was that Stilwell had refused to release Lend-Lease supplies even when they were readily available in Yunnan. Chiang argues that only a minuscule number of arms had been released for China's use. As a result, he declared, "We have taken Myitkyina, but we have lost almost all of East China, and in this, General Stilwell cannot be absolved of great responsibility." Chiang also says that China is not in danger of collapse, and he has a real issue with Roosevelt suggesting they'll withhold aid because China is in trouble. Chiang sends this through Patrick Hurley, Roosevelt's envoy, and Hurley adds that Chiang and Stilwell just cannot work together, and Roosevelt has to choose one or the other. And there's no other Chinese leader who has what Chiang has. And if Stilwell stays, all of China might be lost. Well, I wonder what Roosevelt will do. Roosevelt's military forces, they're pretty active this week. On the 10th, Mark Mitscher's Task Force 38, with 11 fleet carriers, 6 escort carriers, 6 battleships, and loads of cruisers and destroyers, starts a series of raiding operations in 4 groups, 2 on Okinawa and 1 each against Sakashima and Onami-Oshima. From the 12th to the 14th, all 4 groups attack targets on Formosa, and some 500 Japanese planes are destroyed on and above the island. The Japanese do raids of their own, and they do destroy 89 Allied planes and disable 2 cruisers. But here's the thing. Along the stretch from north of Formosa to the Philippines, the Japanese have brought over nearly 1,500 planes from China and the home islands. And imagine if they all made a full strike at once on the carrier fleet. But they're strung out, so each Japanese raid is done with inferior numbers, and as a consequence, they keep losing ever more planes. This is part of an operation that began last month when Bull Halsey's carrier fleet went west to hit places like Formosa and the Philippines that are Japan's inner defense belt. The U.S. also has around 50 subs at sea over here at all times, and even just those in the Luzon Strait sank 250,000 tons of shipping this summer, which is still under a tenth of what the subs will sink here overall this year. I did a special about the war on Japanese shipping, but Japan's logistical and supply empire is very much being constricted. But beyond just shipping, carrier planes also destroyed around 1,000 Japanese planes in September. The American encroachment in the summer and early fall of 1944 had presented the Japanese Army and Navy with a cavalcade of disaster in the loss of New Guinea and the Marianas, and with that the devastation of their land-based air armada in the islands by the American carrier fleet. All signs pointed to an invasion of the Philippines. The leadership of the Navy realized that American sea and air power operating out of the Philippines would cut off their access to the oil of Borneo and Sumatra, leaving the fleet immobile. This would be intolerable. It would mean the end of the Navy, effectively beginning a siege of the home islands and ultimately the loss of the war. To prevent it, the admirals determined on a full fleet attack to destroy the American invasion forces. The odds were heavily against them. Halsey's raids had virtually wiped out their land-based air force in the Ryukyu-Formosa Philippines chain, just as effectively as the Battle of the Philippine Sea had devastated their pool of carrier pilots. Even so, they were determined, at least to delay a farther advance. If they failed, at least the honor of the Navy would remain intact. Well, they are correct that invasion of the Philippines is imminent. It is scheduled to begin next week on the 20th. They are currently, though, still fighting American invasion forces on Peleliu. The methodical elimination of the Yuma Brogol pocket there by the U.S. 5th Marine Regiment continues this week. Armored bulldozers pave the way for flamethrower tanks to destroy the scrub and reveal the network of caves, which engineers seal with explosives, and slowly moving south along the ridges, they begin to tighten and eliminate the pocket with overwhelming firepower, but it will take time for ultimate success. as it is taking time on the Western Front. On the 9th, men from Canadian 3rd Division land at Briskens opposite Flushing. A couple hundred kilometers to the southeast on the 13th, US troops enter Aachen, and there is bloody street fighting. Now, I talked a bit last week about the beginning of the Aachen fight and the breaching of the West Wall. The campaign began to encircle and to take Aachen. Next week, I'm going to backtrack and talk about the events of this week in that campaign. But now, I'll say a few words about Aachen itself. I will also soon be talking more than a few words about the battle for the Scheldt Estuary, which just got 2 sentences today. There is so much going on in the war at the moment that I have to juggle things to make space to cover it all. Anyhow, Aachen. Militarily, the city of Aachen in October 1944 had little to recommend it. Aachen is no natural fortress, nor is it an artificial fortress, even though it lay within the 2 bands of the West Wall. The city's roads were relatively unimportant. Not for a long time would the city's railroads be of use to anyone, so shattered were they from Allied bombs. Nor was Hitler's insistence on a fanatical house-by-house defense of the city simply a superficial propagandism of the first major German city to be threatened with capture. No shrine of National Socialism in the sense of Munich or Nuremberg, Aachen nevertheless embodied a heritage precious to National Socialist ideology. Aachen represented the Holy Roman Empire, the First Reich. At one time, Aachen was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. Here was born Charlemagne, first emperor. In Aachen, between the years 813 and 1531, 32 emperors and kings had been anointed. So, it's kind of a big deal to them. So that's one famous ancient landmark. And another one is relevant this week, the Rubicon River. In Italy, the Germans have been withdrawing from the Rubicon to the Pisciatello River, but with the Allies crossing the Rubicon late last week, Heinrich von Wietinghoff sends 76 Panzer Corps back to the Cinio to get set up to make the Allies pay. The New Zealand 2nd Division and Canadian 1st Division cross the Rubicon the 11th and head for the Pisciatello, and 76 Panzer Corps reaches the Cinio today as the week ends. As for US 5th Army, there's heavy fighting this week for the Livorniano Escarpment. A pretty tough position to take. It's rocky and 5 kilometers long, up to 450 meters high in places, and dominated at the eastern end by Monte delle Formiche. On the 10th, the Americans managed to storm the peak, but strong defenses on the northern slopes stopped them the rest of the week. By the 12th, some 8 American infantry companies reached the top of the escarpment, and they and heavy artillery and heavy airstrikes break the German defenses the 13th and force them to withdraw today. For all of the heavy fighting and the slow gains, the Allies still feel they can reach the Po Valley before the snow comes. Today, the 14th, US 34th Division redeploys at Monte delle Formiche. The plan is to advance along the Idice River and cut the main road east of Bologna. US 91st Division will continue up Route 65, and they'll be supported by the 85th Division. But that is the future, and this week of the war is at its end. With the start of the Moscow Conference, the war rolling into Yugoslavia and Hungary, Army Group North cut off, the Japanese losing hundreds of planes they can't really replace, slow advances in the West and Italy, Chang and Vinegar Joe ever more at odds. And this. Today, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's most famous military figure worldwide, is visited at his home by 2 members of Hitler's staff, Generals Burgdorf and Meisel. It is suspected that he played a part in the failed July 20th assassination plot against Hitler. His name was mentioned under torture, at least, so he is given a choice. He can face a humiliating public trial, which would find him guilty and sentence him to death, as well as his staff, and what would that do to his family? Or he can commit suicide with the cyanide capsule Burgdorf has brought, get a hero state funeral, and a guarantee of immunity from prosecution for his wife and family. Rommel chooses the latter. He informs his wife and son, leaves the town of Ulm in Burgdorf's car, and a few minutes later, the desert fox has shuffled off this mortal coil. it is announced in Germany that he has died of his wounds. He is given that official state funeral and a day of mourning. Wow, Rommel gone. I've been talking about him for years now, and I shall continue to talk about the other big figures of this war until it reaches its conclusion. And I can do that thanks to the Time Ghost Army, for the Army makes all of this possible. You too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest Army officers, and the Army member of the week is Tim Scogliarici. I think that's how you say it. Oh, hey, I mentioned that episode on the war on Japanese shipping. It's both very interesting and very relevant to what's going on in the war right now. You can check it out right here. And do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.